Christmas? That seems like an easy answer, but if you've ever sang the song, The 12 Days of Christmas, and you think the 12 days of Christmas are before Christmas Day, stay tuned. We'll talk about the medieval and Renaissance celebrations of the 12 days of Christmas, which included getting super drunk, gambling, and spending way too much money. So, what happened in the Middle Ages and Renaissance is that during Advent, which we often celebrate with a calendar that has candy in it, they abstained. Those 4 weeks before Christmas were about basically eating less meat. If you were wealthy, the poor didn't have meat necessarily, but all sorts of other things. There was edicts against eating cheese, drinking milk. You basically wanted to prepare yourself for the bawdy Christmas season, but also remember and sacrifice before that season. And then on the 24th of December, you began the celebrations with decorating. And so on the 24th, the women particularly would go out and collect holly and ivy and get everything ready. And the men would go cut down a tree. And so they would cut down, say, an oak. And that tree would be the Yule log. I know now we think of Yule logs as chocolate and cake, but then it would be a log that was decorated with holly and ivy and sometimes ribbons that were dipped in water. And it would be burned throughout the 12 days. And at midnight on the 24th, beginning the 25th, you would have midnight mass. After that solemn mass, the party started. So, for example, in Henry VIII's court, you would have plum pudding, which was actually plum and meat broth and spices. You would have boar's head. You would have many different meats. And then you would have pies, and often a minced meat pie that had 13 ingredients, 12 for the apostles and 1 more for Jesus. And you would celebrate and celebrate and celebrate. I have another long video specifically about some of the royal feasts during the English court in the medieval and Renaissance eras. But after the 25th and you've celebrated, what happens next? Then the 26th is St. Stephen's Day. St. Stephen is the first of the Christian martyrs. He was stoned to death, and he was known for giving to the poor. And so on St. Stephen's Day, you would box up things to give to the poor, and you would give alms. So it would probably be one of the more solemn days of the 12 days of Christmas. And then on the 27th, you went back to the great old festivities. The 27th is St. John's Day. Now, St. John is often seen in art at the Last Supper. He is the saint that was the one who's often leaning on Jesus. He was said to be a beloved of Jesus. He's often seen as younger than the other apostles, and he is, of course, one of the evangelists. But in terms of celebrating, he was known for drinking poisoned wine and living, which meant in the Middle Ages and Renaissance, they celebrated his feast day by getting blotto. They would drink the most expensive wine they could. They might also drink cider that was spiked. It's also on this feast day that people would wassail. So we still have a song, here we come a-wassailing, but wassail was basically spiked cider that you would have in a bowl and often put a piece of bread in it. And the butler basically, or the head of the household staff, would have this giant vat of ale, of cider rather, and they would wait for wassailers to come and demand drinks. So they would basically sing for more drink, and of course the singing got bawdier and bawdier. And it was really basically a drunken fest. So then, after that, on the 28th, you had the Feast of the Innocents. And on the Feast of the Innocents, you actually, during the Feast of the Innocents, you had all sorts of things in Tudor medieval and Renaissance era, including this idea of topsy-turvy. So on December 6th, St. Nick's, they would sometimes nominate a boy to be the bishop. And so he was sort of in charge of the church for that 4 weeks. And on the 28th, his term would come to an end. And on that day, children would be whipped. And but before that, the children, knowing they were going to be whipped, basically would act sort of accordingly throughout the month of December. And so you have stories of children locking out teachers from their teachers from their schoolrooms. They have all sorts of sort of childhood antics up to the 28th. And then on the 28th, they would stop that. And then on the 29th, you're not done partying yet, it's the Feast of Michaelmas, or the Feast of the Archangel Michael and the angels. And so on this day, you would often eat a roasted goose for good luck in the year ahead. And the festivities continued. This was also a time that often people didn't work or worked very few hours, and so the gambling was very, very popular. It was often a time where even if gambling wasn't allowed during the rest of the year, you could gamble. And the 31st, New Year's Eve, was the biggest day for gambling and playing games. Dice playing was huge at this time. You had a lot of wrestling, team sports, just playing basically as much as you could. King Henry VIII, during his time, used that day also to have archery contests, just to show how powerful his army was. So it was a whole lot of day. And then the next day, on the 1st, that was when, particularly in Renaissance England, you have the exchanging of gifts. Henry VIII apparently was very excited about giving gifts, and he, for example, in 1 year spent the equivalent of $500,000 for gifts for his court. Of course, the court also gave him gifts because this was the one moment you could maybe get the eye or the ear of the king. So then, is that it? Does it end on New Year's Day? Not at all. So throughout this festivities, there would have been pantomimes. There would have actually been much more bawdy. There was all sorts of masked plays. There was singing, so much singing and reveling and acting and drinking. And then it would really come to a close with one last enormous party, which was the 5th of January. And you would celebrate that because the 6th of January is Epiphany. And so on that day, on the 5th of January, you would celebrate with an enormous feast that included basically what we would now call a king's cake. A cake that might be shaped like a crown, that had all sorts of sweetmeats and dried and sweetened fruits, and it would have a coin in it, and that would be the person whoever got it was the lucky person, the person who was king. And then finally, on the 6th, you had the Feast of Epiphany, when the kings arrive, and that was often celebrated with the eating of another feast of lamb. So Epiphany, January 6th, you've had your roast lamb or mutton, and then you actually would have an Epiphany tart, which is a tart shaped as a star. And then you're done, right? Well, yes, you are done with the 12 days of Christmas, but actually the holiday season often then continued with more feast days, not as concentrated, not as much drinking, not as much gambling, until February 2nd at Candlemas. But luckily, on those other days, you had a whole set of other kinds of fun things to do. So that's a whole nother video. Thank you very much for watching Artlust. Join us for the next episode.